Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I'm Mario Fraioli, host of the Morning Shakeout podcast and writer of the newsletter of the same name. My guest here today for this webinar is Andy Blow. He is the co-founder of Precision Fuel and Hydration. You can learn more about his background on the Morning Shakeout podcast. That's episode 117. It feels like forever ago that we did that. I think it was within the last 2 years, but safe to say, I don't think much has changed from your life story since then. Precision Fuel and Hydration has evolved a little bit as a company, but all for the better. What we're going to focus on today is how to think about fueling and hydration for marathons and ultras. We'll talk about what runners usually get wrong, how to troubleshoot common mistakes, where to shift most of your focus in training and racing. I've kind of got like a 5-part outline here that we'll go through. We'll talk about under fueling and aiming for low carb strategies, which is a very popular thing in the ultra world in particular these days. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about over drinking, some of the concerns and dangers around that. We'll talk about actual products, what's better to use, drinks, gels, chews, bars, real food, some combination of those things, how you might use them for different use cases. We're also going to talk about not sufficiently practicing your nutrition strategies before big races, which that's something I take for granted as a coach, but it turns out it's a very common, I hesitate to call it practice, but oversight, I think, by a lot of athletes who don't really practice their nutritional strategy ahead of time. And then kind of related to that, the last thing we'll talk about is knowing your numbers in terms of frequency of intake, caloric needs, sodium needs, all that sort of stuff, how to practice it in training. And then we'll have some opportunity for Q&A at the end. James Phillips, who's on Andy's team at Precision Fuel and Hydration, is also here. He'll turn his mic on at the end and be able to answer some questions as well. But Andy, first off, thanks for joining me. Always a pleasure to chat with you. I think we've done something along these lines a few times now, and I always learn something every time that I talk to you. So I'm excited to see what we can uncover today. The first thing I want to start with is just sort of the title of this webinar. It was like how to think about fueling and hydration for marathons and ultras. And as a coach of primarily marathoners and ultra runners, I think of the two as different sports in a lot of ways. And that certainly relates to the nutrition side of things, but also just training, racing strategies, all of that. There are definitely similarities, but let's start there. What are just some of the general differences in how you think about fueling and hydration for marathons versus ultras? And then we can dig into some of the specifics later in this conversation.
Yeah, I'd agree with you entirely, Mario, that marathons are where fueling and hydration even start to just about get interesting for runners, really. But ultras, they become an integral part of the race. Yeah, it wasn't that many years ago that a lot of marathon runners, or a predominance of marathon runners, were drinking and eating either nothing or very little during races and still running some phenomenally fast times. Now, I think what we've learned is that showed that it was possible to run a fast marathon without really eating and drinking much. Not necessarily that it was optimal to do so, but if you look at the physiology of what's going on, if you go into a marathon, especially in cool conditions or cold conditions, well fueled, really well carbo loaded, really well hydrated, you're only going to start to potentially run into trouble towards the latter stages, if at all, if you're a really fast runner. So the kind of ability for fueling and hydration to move the needle in a marathon is more limited than it is in the much longer races. And I would say in the much longer races, the longer the race gets, almost the more significant the role it has in how you're going to finish in the end.
Yeah. Anecdotally, speaking from my own experience, having started in marathons before I got into ultras and then refocused some of my attention on marathons, I had a lot of trouble fueling early on. I'm a faster marathoner. I debuted in under 2:30. Most of my marathons have been within a few minutes of that on either side. And I struggled to get calories down in any form, really, and really anything down. Even just sipping on water proved to be difficult for me. And I would finish my marathons having consumed, and I'm not exaggerating, like maybe 150 calories at a stretch, usually less than that. So I couldn't get anything down, and I figured that's just how it was. And I was always destroyed coming out of it. It would take me a long time to recover, and I really didn't start getting too interested in nutrition until I started running ultras in 2017, and realized even for a 50K on the trails, which in terms of time was another, at least hour and a half, potentially longer than what I was doing the marathons. And I was like, okay, this is important. I need to focus on it. And did some things well, made some mistakes, and took some of those learnings into, my marathon training after that, like 2018 and beyond, where I actually ran my personal best. And some other times, there's also been a shift, I think, in terms of the types of products that have been introduced then. But long story short, now in a marathon, I can get 500 to 600 calories in over the course of 2.5 hours. And I've seen the difference just in terms of my energy during the race, and certainly the performance at the end. I think there's a very strong correlation between the two, but also in just how well I come out of it and recover afterward from just being able to sufficiently, keep my tank topped off. So, I mean, that's a bit of an aside, but everything that you said right there, just completely sort of like resonated with me. And I think, potentially there are people on this call, but I know certainly athletes that I coach and others that I've talked to who've experienced something similar, even if they've never run an ultra. But marathons, they're just like, I don't really need to take too much. Things don't get interesting. But I mean, as we've seen at the top level of the sport, and certainly down to the age group levels, it can be a huge difference in terms of performance and also recovery afterward.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of what you just said there. I think a lot of marathon, the typical journey for a lot of people into marathon running, especially if they've been a competitive runner beforehand, has been to move up the distances. And if you move up from 5Ks, 10Ks, 10 miles, half marathons into marathon, you sort of go through this process where eating and drinking while you're running is completely alien to you, because your sessions are often 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Maybe if it's hot and you're down the track in the summer, you'll have a bottle by the side of the track and you'll drink in between intervals. But the thought of trying to choke down fluids and gels and things while you're kind of smashing along at 5 minutes 30 a mile is not practiced. And I've definitely seen it in some of the elite marathon runners that we've worked with who are coming through the distances, where there's been a lack of emphasis on eating and drinking during training because it's not largely been required. There's then a bit of almost a fear factor of trying to do it, because if you're like you are, if you're a fast marathoner, you're running very close to your threshold or at your threshold the whole way. So actually breathing, eating, drinking at the same time is genuinely challenging. So I think a lot of those factors combine, and people like to ignore the idea of trying it. And then because you don't feel confident with it in a race, you don't then pursue it. You don't try and use the aid stations for fear of getting it wrong or for fear of choking on it. So however, when you go through the process of learning, particularly with fuel, I mean, hydration can be significant in a marathon if it's hot enough. And there are certainly hot marathons around the world where it comes into play. But most of the time with marathon, we would probably say, as a general rule, fueling is more impactful to performance than hydration is.
Right.
And energy levels in the latter part, and also things like muscle damage, which is why you've probably found that you're recovering more slowly afterwards. Glycogen depletion in as it gets more severe will lead to more muscular damage. There's been studies that have looked into increasing carbohydrate consumption during long distance running, and it basically shows that more carbohydrate that you consume, the more you can reduce inflammation and muscle damage after the training session or race. So they're kind of things which I think marathon runners could do well to get comfortable with. And gateway to, I know we're going to talk about sort of training for eating and drinking when you're racing, but I would say for marathoners in particular, the challenge is finding enough long sessions when you can really fuel and hydrate fairly aggressively like you're going to in a race to provide that level of simulation. I mean, at most, it's probably going to be one session a week most of the time, and that might not be a week over a short window. So I think that's a good mindset to get into.
Yeah, you just hit on something which I hadn't really given a lot of thought about, but is certainly true in my own experience. I've seen it in my coaching as well, because I did come up from that 5K, 10K background. A lot of times when you move to the marathon, as silly as it sounds, you don't want to be inconvenienced by having to carry something. There are a lot of runners with that type of background who are just like, I don't want to carry a water bottle or worry about weighing my shorts down with gels or whatever it happens to be. So I'll do what I need to do to get through. And if it's really hot, maybe I'll stop by a water fountain in the middle of the run and I'll, take a few sips and get on my way. Whereas ultra runners, I think because the distances are so long and they realize, okay, fueling and hydration are an integral part of this. They're used to wearing vests or handhelds. When they drop down to marathons, it's just, okay, well, what do I need to do to fuel for this thing, even though it's shorter than I would typically go. And that's what happened for me. I mean, I got used to carrying a handheld on my ultra training runs. I was like, oh, this actually isn't that bad. It's not as much of an inconvenience as I thought. And if I started carrying it with me during my marathon long runs, I'm like, oh, this is great. I can get a couple hundred calories per hour. And the difference in how I felt and how I was able to perform was night and day. But I'd never really given it that much thought. But I think there's a lot of truth to that as well. And I want to segue that into talking about underfueling. And this is really kind of a two-sided topic that I want to touch. I think with marathoners, there is a tendency to underfuel, and I think that happens in ultras as well. Let's start with that, and then we can do the low carb thing after we hit that discussion. But I want to talk about getting enough calories and carbs in a long race or in a demanding training, and just I know there is some research about that, as you just talked about, in terms of muscle damage and and performance, but from what you see in your work, is this a bit of an endemic problem with a lot of endurance athletes? Is that they're mostly underfueling or just not really educated enough on what the needs are for their particular event?
I think you get all sorts of problems around fueling with endurance athletes, everything from not enough to actually on occasion too much. But I would say, as a group, again, I'm generalizing, so there's always exceptions, but as a group, marathoners and ultra runners perhaps underfuel more habitually in training and things. Like I grew up doing triathlon. I ran, but I also rode a bike from an early age. And I learned early on from going out, even as a youngster, doing like 4, 5, 6 hour bike rides, that you really had to fuel and you had to drink on those rides. Otherwise, you were really going to suffer later on. And you've also got the convenience on a bike where you literally wear a jersey with pockets made for carrying fuel. You've got 2 bottle cages normally on your bike for carrying liquids. So it's kind of built in and really simple to do. Whereas I think one of the big reasons that runners will underfuel more has got nothing to do with any thought process other than as you point out, like the inconvenience of it. Where do I carry this stuff? I'm a marathoner. I don't want to look like an ultra runner with a rucksack on. And it's kind of a bit overkill, because actually most of us can. You can easily, if you're fit, you can go out and knock out 90-minute, even close to a 2-hour training run a lot of the time without carrying stuff. And it feels like the right thing to do. I think the other thing that pushes people towards underfueling is this idea that, if I'm sparing with my fueling in training, I'll find the benefit of it more when I race, and I use the gels and that kind of thing. So it's kind of a tough. I definitely used to think a little bit like that. It's like, if I can get away with fueling less when I'm running or when I'm training, then obviously if I take more in the race, that's suddenly going to give me more energy. I'm going to be more used to it. And there are very infrequent arguments, I think, to be made for some strategic training with less fuel, but they are very few and far between compared with the benefits that you can gain from fuel training more aggressively. And so there's that kind of mindset. Potentially there's the whole kind of, trying to get down to race weight type mindset as well. So I'm going to do my long runs fasted, or I'm going to do my long runs on minimal fuel because I'm trying to burn calories and not put more in. And I think a combination of those factors is what leads runners to potentially take on board less fuel than is optimal. And I think the way to reframe that and think about it is not think about what can, what do I need to get through this session? If it's a long run, it's to think about the entire week of training. And I know for sure now that I've often said to people, I think I learned a lot of this in actually becoming a dad and still going out and doing a long training session on a Saturday morning sometimes, or a Sunday morning, that you recover so much better and so much faster if you fuel and hydrate well in a session, that if I've got to come home from a 90-minute run or a 2-hour run and be a dad to some small children, then, I can't afford to be broken and lying on the couch and absolutely, knocked on my backside. So you kind of fuel more and you learn, actually, I'm still standing upright and feeling good after that. And clearly that's optimal for the rest of your life. But I think it's also optimal in terms of knocking on to being able to back that training session up with another one the next day. And certainly anyone who's ambitious on running quite a lot of mileage or doing some pretty long sessions, a lot of ultra runners will run back-to-backs on the weekend, sort of long, because clearly running 50, 60, 70K or whatever in one stretch is unusual and it's going to beat you up. But running 30K 2 days over the weekend is far more manageable. Well, if you're going to do that well, you've really got to fuel that first run if you want to get the most out of the second one and not be broken for it. So I think it's breaking down, and I'm really sort of trying to think about, okay, what is stopping me from, or what's preventing me from fueling this optimally, and then finding ways around it. Designing run loops where you can pick stuff up if you don't want to carry stuff. Even, I know that a lot of ultra runners will just take cash with them. If you're going past gas stations or whatever, but know on your route where you can stop and get stuff. If you're really anti-carrying it, you've got to find other creative ways, but try and get it into the routine and understand why you're doing it.
Yeah, I know there are individual differences in terms of what each of us are going to need at a certain point of training, but is there a baseline in terms of just thinking about fueling from a caloric standpoint of like what you need to get in per hour in order to make sure that you're, let's just call it, adequately fueled for your long training session or perhaps for a race?
I think if you're running for anything more than a couple of hours, then getting in something in the region of 60 grams, maybe a little bit more of carbohydrate per hour is a decent general amount for anyone to aim for. If you're on the faster or bigger end of the spectrum, where you're either moving a lot faster and burning a lot of energy, or you're just a bigger human being, then maybe edging it up towards 70, 80, 90 grams is a good amount. That's what we typically see in faster moving athletes in quick long races. But that equates to, it depends what kind of products you're using. If we talk energy gels, it's usually 2 to 3 energy gels in an hour, which sounds like a huge amount to most runners when you first tell it to them. And I think if you're not doing anywhere near that at the moment, you don't have to leap straight in at that amount.
Right.
You kind of build up towards it and honestly assess how you feel off the back of it. Because I would always be surprised to hear people say that they feel worse from adding a little bit of fueling in like that on a long run versus whatever they're doing at the moment.
Yeah, it's like anything else. It just takes time to adapt to that intake and gradually bring it up over time. So how do you square that? And I know this is more of an ultra running specific thing that we read about, strategy that people employ, and that's of a low carb strategy. Whether it's keto or whatever label you want to slap on it, but basically running longer distances, and people say they feel better and recover faster when they are like low to no carbohydrate intake. But you're saying, as a baseline, most people probably need at least 60 grams per hour or more. Does it have, just give me your thoughts on that, and we can kind of break it down a little bit further.
Yeah, the idea of running on low carb is really appealing for ultra runners. And a few years ago, about probably 10, 12 years ago, it really started to get some traction with people, trying to do this low carbohydrate diet, because when you exercise at a high intensity, you burn predominantly carbs, and you've got about 90 minutes to 2 hours of stored carbohydrate in your muscles in your liver in terms of glycogen. But you've got, virtually quote unquote unlimited fat reserves. Even a skinny person has many times more calories stored in fat that can be accessed during exercise. of a low enough intensity. So you've kind of got this fuel tank that you can't tap into unless you adapt the body to learn to burn it. And so there's a theory that if you train at a low to moderate intensity and restrict dietary carbohydrate, then your body has to do something. It has to learn to burn more fat. And lab studies have shown that when you measure what someone's burning by measuring the expired gases from them, you measure the ratio of carbon dioxide production to oxygen consumption, and you can see when people burn more fat or more carbs. So you can get a good number on this. And sure enough, if you don't eat carbs, if you run steadily and train yourself to do so over a period of time, you do start to burn a higher percentage of fat and a lower percentage of carbohydrate. The problem with it comes in that it kind of puts a rev limiter on your top end, or it does for the vast majority of people. So and even at the pace a lot of people will go in an ultra distance marathon, then you are still, if you even want to be vaguely competitive in terms of pushing yourself quite hard, and if it's hilly and you're going up in it, you're going to go into the zone when you're burning carbohydrate, and there's this limiter on your performance. There's also a lot of reports. I've chatted to a lot of ultra running coaches, Ironman coaches, people who work with athletes at a high level, and the one message that comes back from trying to do this low carbohydrate thing is that it's certainly not for everyone. Like, some people really don't adapt to it very well at all. Some people adapt pretty well to it, but no one can perform any decent high intensity work at it. So it's always a difficult one, because you can't, there are examples, and very famous examples, of some really decent runners out there who have gone keto or gone low carb and achieved some pretty phenomenal finishes and results doing it. But they are the exception to the rule. Certainly, I've not really seen any winning big races, and and winning big races isn't what all of us want to do. Sometimes we want to do things that are fat adapted, but the Trent Stellingworth, I sent you, I think, an infographic from a paper when we were talking about this webinar, because I thought this is a really good one, where he specifically analysed the dietary intake and the carbohydrate and fat intake of a load of runners, some of whom had said they were trying to go more low carb and running things like the Western States. And when it boiled down, when they actually analysed their intake in the race, it was still following, the kind of 60, 70 grams of carbohydrate an hour guidelines, really. They were eating more foods with fat in them some of the time, but the amount of stuff they were eating still gave them a decent amount of carbs. So there's a difference sometimes between the theory of low carb and the actual practice. And as well as limiting them the top end, the other problem that it can drive is like in the recovery side. It can be so it's not something that you would say, that I would ever say to people like it's a complete no-go, or there are reasons why people might try it and they might want to have a go with it, but you have to understand that it's got a very limited use case, and the longer and slower the event, the more likely it is to be of use.
Yeah. Is there a way that we can share that infographic maybe in the chat for people? James, I don't know if you have access to it. I remember it was in the document that we were going back and forth on ideas with, but there's a way to share that. I mean, I have the link to the PubMed study, which I think most people can probably just access the abstract, but I'll put that in there. It's in the chat if anyone wants to check it out. My last question on this topic before we move on to some hydration talk is there a way in training, if you really want to, optimize two things, really, your ability to burn fat as fuel, but also use carbohydrate to fuel higher performance, to do that in training, where maybe there are some days where you go low to no carb for some workouts, but then you pick your spots in terms of fueling yourself on a regular schedule with primarily carbohydrates, so that you can rev your engine a little bit higher and get more out of yourself?
Yeah, there's a famous paper written by the guys at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, and they entitled it Fuel for the Work Required, where they looked at carbohydrate cycling for athletes, which is what you're referring to there, I think, where essentially you have these they did it as a traffic light system, like green, amber and red sessions or days when you manipulate carbohydrate around sessions. And predominantly they were suggesting that if you did some lower intensity efforts on certain days where you weren't measuring, you weren't revving the engine, you weren't aiming for top performance, and you had adequate time to recover afterwards, you could run on a lower carb schedule and maybe stimulate the body. Because when you train in a low carb state, you get augmented cell signaling, which means the cells basically give off stronger signals to adapt in an endurance manner. So the theory being that might enhance overall adaptations. And it kind of, that approach, if you're going to try low carbohydrate stuff, maybe feels more like the sensible approach, because you're not then trying to do, you're not trying to have your, it's probably the wrong phrase, but you're not trying to have your cake and eat it. You're sort of doing the low intensity session with no cake. And then you are when you're training really hard, because you're looking for different types of adaptations. That works brilliantly as a theory, but what I've seen is that you tell an endurance athlete that training with low carbs will be good, and then, or before you know it, they're banging out quite a few sessions that tend to get harder on low carbohydrate, and you can precipitate a spiral of going into sort of overtraining and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a use with caution. And if you want to be overly simplistic and glib about fuel for the work required, it's like eat more on the days when you train really hard and like eat less on the days when you don't. And that kind of seems like a sensible approach anyway.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Moving on through our outline, we had flagged over drinking as something to talk about. Over drinking to pre-hydrate. There has been studies on this in ultras primarily, and it's a fairly common practice. I mean, I've done it myself before ultras and marathons, where I'll preload, usually with a moderately sodium heavy drink the night before and or morning of, and especially when it's going to be warm out, because I'm a moderately heavy sweater, and I'm concerned that I potentially am going to dehydrate. So understanding that aggressive prehydration, I guess, it's not only unnecessary, but it's potentially harmful, is as important as understanding the role of electrolytes in fluid balance and how to use it pre and during races. So that's what we had in the outline. I'd love to just get your thoughts on that, on this overdrink, tendency to overdrink, and the importance, or maybe lack of importance, of prehydrating before key training sessions or bigger race efforts.
Yeah, I think one of the big insights about overhydration before ultras and that kind of thing comes from the studies. They've done some studies at the Spartathon in Greece, which is obviously very long. I think it's 145 miles. It's very hot. And on the start line, they've done some blood draws on a couple of occasions and measured lots of things, including the electrolyte levels in the blood of the participants. And electrolyte levels in the blood are normally really tightly regulated. So if we drew from everyone who's on this call now, you'd probably see them all fall. The sodium levels would fall in a really narrow range, you would hope. It'd be like 135 to 145 millimoles is normal levels. And it's unusual to see them deviate outside of that in normal daily life with healthy people. All of a sudden, on the start line of the ultra marathon, they're seeing 10 or 15% of people who are mildly hyponatremic, which means that their blood sodium levels are already diluted down below 135 millimoles. And one of the only sort of plausible reasons you would see that in a group of otherwise fit and healthy people is that they've overconsumed water in the last few hours or couple of days. And that's kind of quite a typical practice that we do see before races in the heat, because we all do it. We all get nervous that we're going to get dehydrated, and we think that the best possible course of action then is just to drink plenty of water in the build-up. And I think whilst drinking a little bit of extra water in the build-up to a race is a sensible precaution, if you overdo it, you activate the kidneys to flush fluid out. It's exactly the same technique, ironically, that bodybuilders and other athletes that do weight cutting for sports will use. They'll overdrink water in the days leading up to an event, and then they'll stop all of a sudden, and the kidneys overrun and they pee out more fluid and end up more dehydrated, because there's a bit of a lag. The hormones that tell your body how much to pee aren't quite in sync. And so the way to avoid that is more to not focus too much on drinking loads of water and waiting until we all think our wee has got to be really, really clear before you start a race, but actually it's better that it's not. It's better that it's kind of normal straw colored. And if you take some extra sodium, a little bit maybe the night before, but predominantly in the hour or two before the race, so you take a strong drink with lots of electrolytes and lots of sodium in, that will be absorbed. It will hold that extra fluid in your blood plasma, which is where it needs to be, and it won't cause you to just run to the toilet peeing the whole time. And it's having the confidence to know that you can pre-hydrate without taking loads and loads of extra on board. It's kind of not the same as we think, because we all know about carbohydrate loading and the fact that you can do that over 2 or 3 days before, and actually upping your carb intake 2 or 3 days before a race, you can store quite a bit more than you've normally got on board. Water's not the same though, or not to the same extent, and just realizing that over drinking is as bad, if not worse, than under drinking. There's a balance to be felt.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I've never run into any issues with that, but when I did start, I mean, you and I had a conversation a couple of years ago as I was prepping for some marathons. When I did start kind of just preloading the night before, morning of, and not overdoing it. I mean, it was literally like a pint glass with 1,000 milligrams of sodium in it. I just noticed that I was much better off, during the race, whether it was a warm weather day, which I did have one of those, or if it was kind of like more ideal conditions. That seemed to have made a big difference for me, but I never felt waterlogged in the days before the race, or bloated. And I know people that I've worked with and just have spoken to in general who have had that. They've started almost like too far out, and like you described with the bodybuilders, kind of get themselves into trouble by the time that they line up for the race.
Yeah, and I think you see it when people travel to races as well, because we all know that especially if you've flown in somewhere, or you're changing environments, you get a bit nervous. All runners, we all walk around with a bottle or for days before an event, like sipping everywhere we go, because we're just nervous about this fact of I can't get dehydrated today. And that nervous energy and anticipation, coupled with changing environment and those kind of things, can easily lead to people overdoing it. And I think the main message
overcorrect
is you're overcorrecting, and you're also at the same time you're probably tapering, so you're actually sweating less and training less, so it's everything on the fluid loss side is dropping off. And I think it's just good to stop and think about, okay, well, when is enough before this? I mean, I even find myself still having to resist the urge to do it now, especially if I go somewhere hot, because I'm not used to that hot environment. I'm second guessing how much more is this going to dehydrate me. But what I've learned, I suppose, through experience, is just to listen to that voice and just kind of dismiss it and try to keep a bit more of a lid on it. Yeah,
I suppose there are people who are listening to this where that intuitively makes sense, but they don't trust themselves to listen to that voice. Is there some kind of marker that you can look at? I don't know if there's anything that you can measure, but it's like, all right, you shouldn't be going to the bathroom 3 times an hour. I mean, you should be on like a more normal schedule. If you're going to what you said earlier, just like your pee looks normal, like you're fine, you don't have to worry too much about it. But is there anything to like concrete that you can look for or measure that should give you a little more peace of mind that you haven't either overdone it and or underdone it from a hydration standpoint?
There's probably 2 things I would say. Sometimes there's people look at the color of their urine, because if your urine's really, really dark and yellow, then there's a good chance you're getting dehydrated. What it's actually showing you is that your kidneys are holding on to and conserving water, and they're not excreting a lot. Now, dehydration isn't the sole cause of that, but it's the most common one. So you can look at that and think, if you're thirsty and your pee is really yellow. The other thing is, if you weigh yourself regularly and you see your weight has dropped significantly, then that can be a sign that you're getting dehydrated as well. So keeping an eye on your morning body weight, I encourage athletes to do that sometimes, especially when they're moving around in different environments, because going somewhere hot and humid all of a sudden, a couple of days there, you can find there's a bit of an adjustment period. Before a race, if it's an ultra race, I would usually expect your body weight to go up ever so slightly, but not massively. And the reason it goes up slightly is not because you're putting on weight per se, as we'd think about putting on fat, but your glycogen stores are going up. The water that you're holding on to with those glycogen stores is heavy, and also you are becoming a little bit better hydrated. So for me, I talk in kilos, unfortunately for you guys, but I would probably train at like 68 or 69 kilos when I was really fit, but approaching a race, I might be 70 or 71 kilos if it was a long race, because I've got a couple of extra kilos of carbs and fluids on board. What I wouldn't want to see is it drifting up much more than that. If you're feeling like you've got puffy fingers, you can't get a ring off, that kind of stuff, that can be signs that you're over drinking and holding on to too much fluid as well. So unfortunately, there's no one sign you can read. But what I can say is if you're peeing normally, the normal amount of times you are for you in a day, 3-4 times, whatever, and it's not suddenly becoming 8 or 9 times or 10 times a day, then you're probably in good shape.
Mm-hmm. Let's use this as a jumping off point into the next thing I want to discuss, which is what sources of fuel and hydration we should actually use, primarily in races. And this goes for marathons and ultras, because what we've seen on the marathon side of things, certainly over the last few years, is a lot of the elite athletes who have access to their own water bottles. Most of them, I would say, are taking, that water bottle, every few miles during a race, and it's full of some sort of carbohydrate drink. It's an easy and effective way to deliver the carbs that they need. And that might be all they take. They may not pop a gel. Those of us behind the elites, we don't have access to all those water bottles, so most of us are taking gels. But I do know people, who will have supporters somewhere along the course. Whether or not that's actually legal or not is a discussion for a different day, but they'll be handed a bottle so that they can get in, quite a few carbohydrates. It's just easier than taking gels. They can take their time with it. Certainly in ultra races, I know of some top athletes who, have gone 100 miles, doing completely, liquid fuel. But obviously with an ultra race, the longer the race goes, the intensity is different. You have more sources of fuel at your disposal. You can go blocked, you can go gels, you can go real food, type of thing. So I know what's best is going to depend on the person and the environment and what it is that they're trying to do. But when might liquid carbs be best over, say a gel, and what factors into those decisions? Or, when might you want to use like real food, and potentially like some sports nutrition product that's not liquid, gel, chew of some sort over liquid? Just how do you generally think about that, given these different things that people are doing?
Yeah, you're 100% right in the fact that it obviously does depend on a few things, but you've got to start somewhere with this kind of breakdown. And I'd say if you start with marathon running, especially in cooler conditions, then a liquid with a very high carbohydrate content, so what you'd call a hypertonic drink, so something that's not isotonic being the same sort of thickness as your blood and hypertonic being a bit thicker. Generally speaking, a hypertonic drink is going to be the preference in a cool marathon, because it's really digestible. You don't have to chew it at all. It can go straight down even if you're breathing hard. It delivers a lot of carbohydrate. So you could be as strong as 10 or 12% carbohydrate, which would give you, in 16 ounces, 12% carbohydrate would give you like 60 grams of carbs. It's quite a lot it packs quite a lot of carbohydrate in for a small volume. And yeah, really quickly into your bloodstream, which is where you want to get it. And you can tune that. And I think based on what we've done with a lot of elite marathon runners, they're pretty intelligent often about increasing the carb content when marathons are colder. So you drink less total volume, but get the same amount of carbs, or decreasing carbohydrate content so that the drinks get thinner as it gets hotter. So you would basically probably flip-flop from somewhere between around about a 5 or 6% carbohydrate solution when it's warm or hot and you're drinking a pretty high volume because you want the liquids to offset what you're sweating. And you might go right up to a 12, 13, 14 even percent thick sort of carbohydrate drink, syrupy drink when it's cooler. colder. And I think as a general rule, that works really, really well, because the predominant requirement is carbs and the secondary requirement is fluid.
Mm-hmm.
That where people can run into problems is if you extrapolate that approach out too far into really long distance races, because at some point you need to probably think about decoupling your fluid and electrolyte needs from your carbohydrate needs, because even with the best planning and the best knowledge of the weather and all that kind of stuff, making a ratio of drink that works consistently for you for hour after hour after hour is just not going to happen. At some point, you might need more carbs and less fluid, or more salt and less carbs. Another point, you might need more, you might need more calories, and you don't want to drink vastly more volume of fluid to get them, because your stomach's had enough of that. So you want to take something more solid. So that's where starting to bring in gels and chews and bars and real food happens. And that's obviously typically what you'll see. You'll see that as the races get longer, people gravitate along the trajectory from sports drinks to gels and sports drinks to chews and gels and sports drinks, to kind of almost at some point fully separating it out and going, I'm going to drink water, I'm going to take electrolytes separately, I'm going to take carbohydrates separately, and probably even some other macros, so some protein and fat and things like that. Not necessarily because they offer, they're something that you really need in the short term, but they fulfill you in a different way. They settle your stomach, or they give you some a bit more morale and a bit of an energy boost in a different way. So it's a case of splitting those things out. And I often think it also aligns with the speed that people are moving at. We've worked with Hayden Hawks recently, who was second at Western States last year in a pretty quick time. And Hayden uses, which I think is a good approach, he uses like a base of sports nutrition products. So he'll have about 60 grams of carbs an hour, usually from a couple of gels or a gel and a chew. He'll usually have about half a litre of electrolyte drink as well. And then on top of that, he'll layer on some of the more real food type options that he feels like eating when he sees them or when they're offered to him. And he's got a bit of his crew have knowledge of what those things might be. And so I always like that as an approach, that you use. Like, sports nutrition is good as a base for fueling an ultra. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't kind of then matter whether you're getting your numbers from from gels, from chews, from bars, or whatever. It's whatever you prefer. And then on top of that, you listen to your body a bit more about, oh, do I fancy some of these? They've got boiled potatoes and salt at this aid station. Do they look good? Or I fancy one of those sandwiches. Because we've probably all been there in a long race. You get to some place, they've got a pizza there, and it looks like the best thing in the world. Or at another time, you couldn't imagine putting it in your mouth. And you've got to listen to your body a little bit around that.
Yeah, no, I'm chuckling. And I don't think this is an uncommon experience for ultra runners, especially newer ones. But when I first got into ultra running, I, tried to do everything right in my eyes early on. So I would take, in my bottle, I would have, sports drink that was, fairly dense in calories, but I would also have gels on me, and I would try to take some real food early on, just try to kind of get all the birds with all the stones. And ultimately what ended up happening is like something would go south. And then by the end of the race, I realized, I was like, okay, I need to rely on, potato chips and, M&Ms for calories. I couldn't drink anything but water. So I needed that for hydration. And I might pop like a salt tab if it were a hot day and I needed to get in, some electrolyte stuff. But that happened because I tried to do everything early on and just kind of like failed in so many areas. And it forced me to like kind of like decouple all of those things, rather than, the mistake that I made was trying to do it all, kind of in one way. And that's something like with the athletes I coach that we talk about as well, is like, rather than screwing it up like I did, like having a strategy going in, being like, okay, how are you going to address your fluid and electrolyte needs? How are you going to address like your calorie needs? What are your, kind of A, B, and C options, and how are those going to change throughout the race? And I think those are important strategies to have in place, certainly for the race, but also things to practice, in training. On the other side of it, with marathons, obviously, you're not going to, most people, I'm certainly not eating real foods during a marathon. And again, it's going to depend on, the weather. And where I've landed in the last couple of years, it's been very helpful because I don't have a lot of access to bottles, and I'm not going to race with a bottle in my hand the entire way or fill it. But I started with one, usually with, 2 scoops of pH in there, so that I'm getting, like, from the get-go, I'm getting a good amount of calories and carbohydrates, but I'm also, like, staying on top of my fluid from the very beginning. And later in the race, I don't really have access to much else besides the water at the tables, but I've got my gels, and then I go to gels, and I'll take 3 or 4 gels over the course of a marathon, and that's actually seemed to work pretty well for me. I feel like it gets me off to a good start in terms of fluid intake, and also calories and carbohydrates. And then, unless it's a hot day, the fluid doesn't matter quite as much to me the rest of the way, but I still know that I need to get the calories in via gel. So it's like everything that you just said, I'm like, yeah, that all makes sense. And I've definitely learned it all the hard way as well, which I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have too.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is the typical way which a lot of us learn in these things. And there's always going to be an element of that. But I think what a lot of athletes aren't always prepared to do is, if you don't know too much about what you're doing with regards to putting a fueling and hydration plan together for an ultra, it can be tempting to sort of focus on the training and sweep that under the carpet and think, oh, I'll kind of like figure that out as I go, and I'll take a bunch of this stuff with me and I'll see what I fancy. But the problem with that is that if you don't go in and commit reasonably hard to a plan of some sort, and it's fine to like deviate and pivot from a plan during an event, that's usual, but you've got to go in with a plan of some sort, and then be reasonably critical about then recording what you did, analyzing it afterwards, and so that you can build on it for the next time. Because these races are usually ultras are relatively infrequent. They're pretty expensive. You invest a lot of time and effort into being ready to get on the start line. And then I always feel like if you fail from a nutritional standpoint, the very least you want to take away from it is an understanding of what you did and where it might have gone wrong, so that you can not make that same mistake again. And I think that, especially with an ultra where you've got a crew, they can be invaluable in helping with that, because especially if you have the same crew that helps you time and time again, they can get to know what, along with you, they can go on that journey. Right. Mario looks a bit like this now. We should probably get him some Coca-Cola. This is where he's going to some sugar and caffeine, or he's refusing to eat now, and actually that means he knows himself. We don't need to force, or actually when he starts refusing to eat, that's when we need to start force feeding him gummy bears or something like that, because it's so different the way that different people's bodies respond and different people. But if you have a plan, at least if your plan is like 60 grams of carbs and 500 mils of fluid an hour, and your crew and you can keep an eye on that, keep some records, and then, like I say, what they always say, that, don't they, that if experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted, and at least you can walk away with the experience on paper then of getting it right.
Yeah. Last thing I want to touch on before we open it up to some questions. I know we only have about 15 or so minutes left here, but let's rope together knowing your numbers and then not sufficiently practicing your nutritional strategies in training before a big race. And you're starting to get there, in the last part of the discussion. But, how do you get to know your numbers in terms of what your, caloric, carbohydrate, fluid needs are per hours? And what's a good way to do that? And then, how do you implement that into your training so that once you get it right, ideally you can replicate it in a race and get through smoothly?
Yeah, I think the knowing your numbers bit is important, because that's what forms the basis for whatever the plan's going to be. And to work out your calorie and carbohydrate needs per hour, there's some pretty well trodden science out there now that suggests that for lower intensity efforts of a long duration, somewhere in the region of sort of 60 grams an hour is a good starting point for carbohydrate consumption, and that for faster athletes and for longer durations, if you can push that up towards 90, and we see in really elite athletes sometimes and pushing beyond that as well, but that kind of 60 to 90 gram window is a really decent starting point for a lot of people. And it's going to sound like a bit of a plug, which I suppose it is in a way, but we, on our website, on the Precision Fuel and Hydration website, we have this fueling and hydration planner. And the whole point of that is that the idea is you punch in some of your physical characteristics, the race that you're doing, and it will give you that window of what the likely carbohydrate requirements are. And that is based on a lot of the scientific research that is out there, plus a healthy dose of the experience that we've got working with athletes. Yeah. And actually, if anything, I would say it's not always easy to nail down, but the carbohydrate and the energy requirement for a long run is often the easier part of the equation than the hydration and electrolytes part, because the caloric demands are going to be very high. They're going to be higher than what you can take in. So tolerating as much as you can within reason is often, going to be where the strategy is at. It doesn't mean literally eat as much as you can, but what it means is that you're always going to be behind the amount of calories you're burning. So right. Finding ways to get more in a palatable fashion is usually the answer to going faster over the long run. When it comes to fluid and electrolytes, they're totally dependent on your individual physiology, and everyone sweats differently, different amounts of salt loss, different amounts of fluid loss, the environment and the intensity. Because Western States is a classic one, because you can start and it can be really quite cold, and then it can go to incredibly hot in the middle of the day, and sweat rates can change. I would imagine hourly sweat rates in that race can go from virtually zero to really, really high and back down again. And so there's a lot more trial and error involved. And what we often recommend people to do in that situation is, if you're unsure, is like weigh yourself before and after some big training sessions and record how much you drink and look at the weight loss, because weight loss often is roughly equivalent to fluid loss. Every kilo of body weight you lose is about a litre of water. 2.2 pounds of body weight loss equates to about a litre of sweat loss. And then you can start to figure out what your hourly sweat loss is. If you're also drinking at the same time, based on how you feel, you can see how much you habitually tend to replace. And what you want to be doing is keeping that sort of level of weight loss under control. There's no magic number. You have to stay within like 1% or 2% or 3% of your body weight. But what you do need to do is get a handle on whether you're someone who loses a lot of weight very quickly, or whether you're good at controlling that. That, coupled with then some information about electrolyte replacement, based on whether you're a heavy sweater or a light sweater, whether you're a salty sweater or not such a salty sweater, you can tune the amount of electrolytes that you put in with the fluids, and that gives you the basis for a plan. And I think that the tool that we've built, which is the one that James has put in the bar, is not designed to be like an infinite guide of all the wisdom you'll ever need, but it's kind of something to get you in the starting in the ballpark.
Yeah, and I know James says in there not a plug, but I'm happy to plug it because I've used it myself and I recommend it to a lot of my athletes, and it will get you that baseline. I mean, the biggest thing I could say about the planner for a lot of people I've sent it to is it's really eye-opening to them. And then when they see, as a baseline, maybe what they should be targeting, and they look at what they've done, they can start to connect the dots kind of in reverse and be like, oh, okay, like this, this makes sense. So, I mean, kudos to you guys. It's a great tool. And I know it took a lot of time to refine that. I'm happy to plug it because I do think it's a valuable resource and a good place to start. And again, like everyone's needs are going to be a little different individual, but that'll give you a good baseline. And then, as you just described, these are things that you need to practice in training and in different types of situations to understand how your body is going to respond. So happy to plug that for you, because I do think it's a valuable resource. In the time that we have left, I'd love to open it up to some questions if you want to leave them in the chat, or if you just want to unmute your microphone, you can fire away to Andy and or James from his team at Precision Fuel and Hydration.
So I just have a question. I did my first 100 a couple of weeks ago, and I found myself during the back half to be going to the bathroom frequently. So how do you tell if you have an imbalance of electrolytes versus just overhydrating? I mean, it sounds like based on what you were saying that it just like you just want to monitor your body and what it's telling you and stuff. But is there,
Yeah,
because I'm a very salty sweater. I did a sweat test and I'm like at 1740 or something. So I'm trying to constantly keep my electrolytes coming in. And so I really hesitate with slowing that down, because then I feel like I'm going to get in a hole again. So is there kind of a good rule of thumb, or?
yeah, it's a tricky one, Sarah, but it's a good one. Well done on doing a 100. That's impressive stuff. I would say, if so, one thing to listen out for with your body when you're doing anything long endurance wise is kind of the feelings and cravings you get. And if you're overhydrating in relation to the amount of salt that you're taking in, you may feel quite bloated and have a slushy kind of stomach because you're not absorbing a lot of the fluid. You may start peeing quite a bit more. And if you've got to kind of close your eyes and imagine what it's like drinking, and is water starting to taste a bit metallic and a bit off-putting, and you don't want to drink anymore. And all of those are kind of signs that your body is trying to tell you, no, fluid wise, we're all good. If salt tastes really good, if you're craving salty things, then that's a really, really strong sign that it's the electrolyte side that's out of balance. So you might have an electrolyte drink and that tastes fantastic, whereas the water tastes terrible. I mean, when the one of the origins of electrolyte drinks overall was in treatment for cholera and diarrhea, and the instruction that the doctors were told to give people was when they were dehydrated from being sick, was when would they know they've had enough to drink of this stuff? Well, this mixture is like a strong mixture of salt and sugar and water mixed together, and when you're dehydrated, that will taste fantastic. And then when you start to get back into homeostasis, it starts to taste really, nasty and over salty and horrid. And I think listening to your body deep into a race is fundamentally critical, because unless you can get, which you obviously can't a lot of the time, is any sort of stats on what's going on in your blood or whatever, you're relying on the end symptoms. So generally speaking, if you're weeing a lot towards the end of a race, it tends to indicate that you've taken too much fluid on and probably should be backing off. Or it could be a little bit of the ratio of fluid to salt is a little bit out, and having the confidence to back off on the fluid a little bit and take some more salt.
So if you have a plan of like 500 milliliters per hour or something, should you just it's just easier for me to do it kind of formulaically when I'm out there, so I don't like all of a sudden go through 2 hours with I haven't done anything. Like, do you recommend just kind of like not drinking for 30 to 60 minutes and then just getting right back on track, or do you just have to be much more fluid than that?
I think honestly, you have to be a little bit more dynamic. When I think you can plan for 3 or 4 hours and that kind of thing. I think when you start to get into like 6 and 8 and 10 and 12 hours, the deviation, the amount of error, if your 500 mil an hour estimate is over by 100 milliliters, then that's not much after 3 hours, but after 10 hours you've had an extra liter than what you needed, and it soon does accumulate. And so what you find with athletes who, as they get more experience, as they pay more attention to their bodies, they probably make micro adjustments. So rather than just going and then stopping drinking for an hour, it's probably more like backing it off to 200 or 300 milliliters an hour for a little while. Okay. And seeing how you feel with that. It's where the biggest challenges come in, I think, also are on the races where you either suffer big swings in temperature, so you're constantly having to dynamically adjust based on that, or when you're being faced with racing in conditions that you don't habitually train in. Because when you train in a certain set of environmental conditions, you become intuitively tuned in to what your body does in those conditions. And if you suddenly go somewhere, you're somewhere hot and dry, and you go somewhere hot and humid, or even worse, you're somewhere like cold and then you go somewhere hot and humid, the difference.
We had about 12 hours of cold and rain. So maybe on another day it would have been fine, but it was just not what I needed.
Yeah, and when it's rainy, see, your fluid needs in the cold and wet they'll never be zero when you're running, but they can be really, really, really low. And that can catch you out if you're someone who's used to training in warmer conditions and have got to keep up with the drinking. Okay. So we've got, if you want to have a look at some case studies of different events, we have quite a few on our website. There's not so many ultras. There's a few. A lot of them are triathlons, but you can filter them. If you go into the athlete section and go into the case studies, you can filter them by different weather conditions. And what's fascinating is you'll see the difference in like fluid consumption levels that even sometimes the same athletes will have in hot conditions versus cold. And the difference can be absolutely massive. We've seen people do an Ironman event on 300 or 400 milliliters of fluid an hour in the cold, and then over a liter per hour in the extreme heat and humidity. So that deviation is massive.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome.
Cool. Do we have time for maybe one more and then we can wrap it?
Yeah.
Are there any out there?
I had a question about sweat tests. I have similar issues that Sarah was describing in terms of, so I'm pretty sure I know I'm a heavy sweater. I have a hypothesis that I'm a salty sweater as well, but I have never been tested. I just know I've had several pretty bad experiences in like second halves of marathons and stuff when the weather conditions have been warm and humid that are very different from my experiences when the weather's, optimal. Yeah. What are so I've looked at the website, I've looked at the sort of lab-based testing options. I'm not anywhere near any of those labs. Like, do you have any recommendations around ways or just the best approach to going about trying to figure out, the electrolyte aspects of what's happening when I'm out there on race day?
Yeah, I think it's I'm going to state the obvious. It's always easier if you can get a number on that sort of thing, because then you go from like making assumptions to sort of actually having some data to play with. But I would say, as a rule of thumb, if you are going to run in hot and humid conditions and want to improve your chances of getting your hydration right, if you are losing quite a bit of salt, then reading the blog that we've got about pre-hydrating and preloading beforehand, like as Mario described, it's like start making sure that you're starting really optimally hydrated and not with over fluid, but with plenty of salt and fluid to be well hydrated is a great starting point. And then I would say looking at using an electrolyte ratio of about 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid that you consume. Setting a target amount of fluid to drink is really tricky because it depends on your sweat rate and but making sure that 1,000 milligrams per liter is about twice the amount of sodium, about twice the electrolytes that are in a standard sports drink. And if you are on the saltier side, that's usually enough for most people to make a discernible impact. And if you're really, really salty, you might want to go up to as much as the 1,500 milligrams a liter. And then it's really a case of sort of nudging it up to try and find the lowest effective dose that helps you on that score. There's always an interesting question to be asked as to whether if you are suffering in the heat, whether it's got to do with the volume of fluid you're losing or the amount of sodium, or it could be both. And that's where doing the home sweat test as well, where you run and you measure your sweat rate in different conditions, is really useful. And if you're able to do that, Bryce, and gather a few days worth of data or a few different sessions worth of data, you can always share that with James and the athlete support team with us, and either get on a call or trade some emails, and we can give you a bit of a steer as to whether the numbers that you're seeing are sort of moderate, like high, really high, and start to help you dial that in. Really, it's a bit of that kind of what I was talking about, that kind of organized trial and error with recording your inputs and outputs and then working towards seeing how you feel.
Got it. Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Before we wrap up, just to follow up on that, Andy, so we haven't mentioned it until now. If you're listening to this, I mean, you can for free, I believe, still schedule a video consult with James or someone else on the PH team. My wife has done it. I've talked to Andy many a times and found it super helpful, but where you can just talk through some of your specific issues and really get, certainly links to resources, but also just great advice in order, to know what your next step should be. And I don't know, I mean, it's a big part of the reason I'm proud of this partnership with Precision Fuel and Hydration. I don't know of any other company that does that. And it's not like a product pushing thing at all. I can promise you that. It's really like to help you solve your nutrition and hydration problems. So that's right on their website. Just like book a video consult, with James or someone else on the team. And it's a really valuable resource. I thank you guys for doing that. I know that was like kind of a COVID thing that started in 2020 and ended up being really, really popular. And I'm glad that you guys are still doing it because I know it's helped a lot of people, speaking from my own experience. So just something else to maybe look into as well. Before we wrap, anything else, James, Andy, you guys would like to plug before we call it quits on this one?
No, I think you've done a great job for us on that. Genuinely, we'd love to chat with people if they want to. James has put the video call link for anyone who's in this video at the moment. You'll be able to see it. If you're watching a recording, I think, just go to our website and find it in the footer. James has just run the stats, actually. How many video calls did we do this year? Putting you on the spot, JP.
It was just over 1,000.
Yeah. I think it was a good amount of calls. So we love it because not only is it great to chat with people about what they're doing sport and triathlon and running wise, but also the database that it builds in our heads and with all the kind of scenarios that we get to run and that sort of thing. It's genuinely a two-way thing. It helps us to figure out where things are going right and wrong for people and helps us to communicate that information more widely. So definitely, jump on a call and get one booked if you want to have a deeper dive into whatever it is that you're struggling with at the moment.
Now, I'll just add really quickly, 20% off at Precision Fuel and Hydration for Cyber Monday. So go out there, check it out, swear by it. I know, I know these guys won't do it, but I'm shameless. I have no problems plugging you guys.
Yeah, that's kind of you, Chris, because you've still got a few hours to go over there, haven't you? We're on the wind down here. We've got 3 hours to go here in the UK.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for this past hour. Hugely valuable as always. James, thanks for hopping into the chat and providing links to all of those resources for everyone. There will be a recording of this. I will send the link out in the Morning Shakeout newsletter. If not this week, certainly next week. But with it being Monday, hope everyone has a great week. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks, Mario.